Hello and welcome to The Big Picture, live on University Radio Nottingham. Apologies to all our loyal listeners that we are late. There was an issue getting into the studio, but we are here now. This is The Big Picture with Felix. Joining us today, we have Luke.
Hello.
Hello, Luke. And Ben.
Hello, Felix.
Hello. So we don't quite know how much time we're going to have because obviously we've only got 20 minutes left of our normal hour slot, but we may be able to overrun. So we're hoping today to cover the protests in China. We're hoping to cover the independent schools and the idea of charity status being removed, which is an idea being floated around by Keir Starmer. And we're also hoping to talk about onshore wind, which I know is a very fascinating topic for you all. So we'll start with China and we'll see how we do. Apologies again for the delay and the uncertainty over what we will actually cover. So China, there have been some protests recently about the zero COVID policy of the Chinese government, where they are under strict lockdowns to ensure no coronavirus. They want zero cases. There was a case where some Chinese civilians died in a fire, and some protesters, some ordinary Chinese citizens, blamed this on the zero COVID policy, and there have been protests in lots of different cities, including chants of people calling for the President Xi Jinping to resign, which of course is not well received by the Chinese government, and there have been plenty of arrests. Now, on a side note, China's Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, is at 0.44, with 0 being the most unequal and 1 being the most equal. It's the lowest in the world, and the people that measure the Gini coefficient say that if a country falls below the 0.4 mark, then there is risk of revolution. Are we seeing that, or is that too early to say? That's what I'm going to ask the panel. But just before I do, I'd like to remind everybody to message in on the website if you want to. Someone has said, let Felix into the studio, so thank you to whoever wrote that. We are in on URN. Okay, to the panel then. What do you both think? Let's start with you, Ben. What do you think? Do you think this is the start of potentially more, or what do you make of the whole thing? What are your general thoughts of the protests in China?
So what I've heard is that it's the biggest nationwide protests in China since Tiananmen Square.
Wow.
But obviously it's not on the scale of Tiananmen Square yet, depending on what happens. I think at the same time it's incredibly uplifting, to see these scenes, these people. I mean, the really powerful thing is people holding up blank sheets of paper, which say nothing, but at the same time say everything. And this, this great expression of this desire for democracy, which is really uplifting. And at the same time, though, this fear about what Xi Jinping would do next, because it seems to me that Xi Jinping, over the last few years, has been playing out the universal failing dictator playbook, because he's adopted a very stringent, China is the most, authoritarian and effective authoritarian state that I've ever read about, and how it controls every aspect of your life. And now he's starting to encounter real opposition. The economy is not doing well. It's not going to do well because they base their economy on borrowing ludicrous amounts of money that they don't actually disclose. And the next step, logically, is to start a war to distract everyone from their troubles. And I think there is very possibly a confrontation over Taiwan looming. And that leads into the whole another potential world-ending conflict as in Ukraine. So at the same time, uplifting and extremely worrying, I would say.
That's very interesting. A lot to unpack there. But before we do, I will go over to you, Luke. What do you think about all this?
It's remarkable and it's momentous, but I'm cautious about the prospect of structural change in China as a result of this. It is protests of a scale not seen since 1989, since Tiananmen Square. But we must remember that the Chinese state bureaucracy is very robust, and they have dealt with protests before. There were protests in 2014 and protests in 2010. This is certainly the largest protest that President Xi has faced, but it's one that the state is quite prepared for, and particularly given that the origin of these protests was in Xinjiang, the apartment that burned down was in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, who obviously are subject to a great deal of state control. If the epicenter of the protest remains in the West and it doesn't spread in very significant numbers to Beijing, to Shanghai, etc., then the state is in a position to control them very effectively. It's certainly still a developing situation, and we'll see over the next couple of weeks whether whether unrest is sustained in the major eastern cities, and I think that will be the key factor to keep an eye on going forward. But more conceptually, talking about what Ben was just discussing about, is this the sign of the failure of a dictator? I don't think yet that is the case. I think this is certainly the largest test of Xi, and we could see more repressive measures. We could see a Tiananmen-style response. But at the moment, I think Xi is probably feeling pretty confident in the state security structures that he spent so long establishing and centralizing around himself. And we will probably see very, very large arrest numbers. We will see all the protesters being tracked to their homes and prosecuted and what have you. And the government will be watching very carefully to see if those measures have the intended effect.
Yeah, both of you mentioned about the President Jinping and how Xi Jinping has a lot of control over the country and a very well-oiled authoritarian regime, different to Russia, where perhaps a mistake from Putin's perspective was that the internet wasn't that well censored, so younger Russians that use the internet were aware of the reality of what was going on with Ukraine, whilst China is a lot more effective at its dictatorship. But yet, of course, there does appear to be at least some cracks showing that perhaps we weren't aware of, and it's interesting that they are directly some protesters are directly requesting the president to resign, which is interesting because we have experienced protests in China before where the protests are more against the local administration, where they think that the central government, the Communist Party, will be able to come in and rescue them. So it's interesting that there is actually this blame on the president. Now, I want to touch on something that you said, Ben, which was very interesting and worrying, perhaps, about Taiwan. Now, President Biden, twice, although his aides have got a little bit worried about him saying this, but he has said twice that the USA will defend Taiwan. So this makes it a little bit different to Ukraine in the fact that Ukraine wasn't in NATO, but Taiwan does have that agreement with the USA. Whether it actually will come about or not is, I suppose, dependent on President Biden's cognitive ability. But do you think that a war with Taiwan, how likely do you think that's going to happen as a sort of a distraction to the protests? And do you think it's going to happen soon? And to what extent do you think that's going to affect perhaps the rest of the world in a potential third world war, perhaps? Or is that hyperbole? What do you think, Ben? I know I've said a lot to you there.
I think the likelihood of some kind of confrontation, I think, is very likely. A direct war, I hope is unlikely. But not impossible, but some kind of confrontation, I think, is very likely because, frankly, I think Xi Jinping has been moving towards it for some years now, and with a house that is now going to be a Republican house, very anti-Biden, he probably sees it as his best chance with a divided Congress, and with a president who, I think, in contrast to Trump, is seen as slightly feebler and weaker, maybe. So I think some kind of confrontation is likely. Now, regardless of whether there's an actual war, I mean, even if there's a blockade of Taiwan, that's devastating for the world because Taiwan produces something like 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors, which is needed for basically any form of advanced tech. So any phone, any laptop, all of that requires advanced semiconductors, and 90% of those come out of Taiwan. And another, I think, 4 or 5% come out of South Korea. So the world supply chain is really going to buckle, I think, even more severely than it is now with the oil crisis if there's any kind of blockade of Taiwan. So it's certainly, I would argue, a greater problem or potential threat than Ukraine and the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which is a big enough threat in itself, I would argue.
Thank you, Ben. Do you agree with this assessment, Luke?
I think you're right to highlight that there's a lot of room for escalation short of war. I think we will probably see over the next 5 years a series of escalations, but not an outright war over Taiwan. But I think the current events in China would actually reduce that likelihood rather than increase it. We might be thinking of something like the Falklands War, where the Argentinian junta was in trouble and decided to launch a war to kind of shore up its domestic credibility. But in China, the dynamic seems to almost be the opposite. China is a very insular country, and a country which is, due to its absolutely massive population, it's very afraid of internal rebellion. The trigger for violence in the Tiananmen protests in 1989 was the threat that the protests in Beijing could spread to other urban areas. If the Chinese government is afraid of rebellion and afraid of internal unrest, it will want to keep its army at home, because it's the primary way in which it will repress unrest is through deploying soldiers in this kind of Tiananmen-style crackdown. It can't do that if it's already committed so much to Taiwan. So we see conflict in Taiwan on the horizon when China feels confident. When although China is looking abroad to the United States and it's looking at the political composition in the House and what have you, those are important factors to China, but they're not the decisive factor. They will assess their own needs and their own circumstances, and that will be the deciding factor. And also, it's worth remembering that China has a very long-term view of foreign policy generally. They have said that they will have Taiwan even if it takes 100 years. And they might take 100 years, and that's more acceptable, I think, to the Chinese foreign policy strategy than to the Western one, for example, where we are bound by electoral cycles and what have you. If China takes a while to get there...
Xi Jinping was elected. It was
90%, certainly he was.
Very popular.
Yeah, but that's the point, really. It's because it's a more autocratic system, they don't fear having to constantly make their case to the public. And indeed, the only sign they have of public response generally is when the violence starts, as we've seen this week, against the kind of zero COVID regime that Xi has attached himself to so directly. So on the question of Taiwan, we may see escalations. I don't rule out that possibility, but we'll see it when China feels confident, not when it feels insecure.
I would dispute... Oh, sorry, Felix.
No, go on. No, go ahead.
I would dispute that. I think China massively focuses on Taiwan, and I think you mentioned Galtieri in Argentina. I think there is a drive in dictatorships when things on the domestic front are going badly to try and start some form of foreign conflict to create a rally behind the flag effect. And China focuses on Taiwan so heavily because, remember, they teach the whole 100 years from the First Opium War as the century of humiliation. That whole idea of China being abused and beaten by Western nations, and that now is the time for China to reclaim that strength, is very core to the Chinese Communist Party's, well, you can argue to what extent it's still communist, but to the Chinese Communist Party's message. And I think, if I was in the Chinese Politburo at the moment, I would recommend a move on Taiwan, because I think, politically thinking, like the whole aspect and the idea of China being now in the position to reassert its strength, I think is really core to who they are, to the education they teach, and to make a move on Taiwan now, I think might have a good effect at uniting the population.
It's a valuable rhetorical tool, and it's a valuable propaganda tool, to be sure. But the consequences of invading Taiwan would be catastrophic, both for China and for the West. If we were to impose the kind of sanctions on China that we've currently imposed on Russia, both China and the West would enter terrible recessions. And China's economy is already a bit of a teetering Jenga tower for a number of reasons, which you highlighted in your opening point. It's easy to believe that China is more stable internally than it is, because there are not a lot of foreign journalists in China at all anymore because of COVID. It's very difficult to enter the country. It's almost they have a vested interest in keeping foreign journalists out anyway. So we don't have a very detailed picture of the internal situation in China beyond what local journalists can sell to the BBC and what have you. So it's easy for us in the West to manufacture this idea that the state is very organized and very controlled. But in truth, the scale of the state bureaucracy and the state security apparatus is there because the system is so unstable. And if you rock the boat by invading Taiwan. The invasion itself would not cause that much of a ripple. I agree that it would cause a rally around the flag effect, and public unrest would probably be reduced. But then you'd have an economic crisis. What happens 1 year after the invasion of Taiwan, when the current sources of anger around COVID are still present, and there's now economic devastation to contend with as well? The Politburo will not be just thinking about what the immediate effects, the immediate quelling effect of invading Taiwan will be. They will be thinking of what happens in a year's time when there are economic sanctions, when the anger around COVID is continuing, because they don't have a long-term solution to the COVID problem. They're hanging on to zero COVID because their vaccination rates are abysmal, and they don't really have the alternative that we have in the West. Because they won't take our vaccines for political reasons. So they've got themselves in a bit of a bind, basically, and the internal picture is much more unstable than it might look to us on the outside.
So in that case, Luke, were you not surprised by these protests? And do you think, as a secondary question, these protests are entirely about the zero COVID policy, or is it more deep-rooted than that? What do you think?
I think there are triggering factors and there are long-term currents underneath them. The triggering factor is certainly COVID, and certainly Xi Jinping has tied himself very inextricably to the zero COVID policy, particularly because he has centralized his rule around himself very strongly in the last couple of years. He has become, like Mao and like Deng, an emblem of the state around which all policy revolves. So when things go really well, when he's talking about the Chinese dream, as he did in 2018 or so, it looks really good, and it's a part of his legacy that he's very proud of. When things don't go very well, as we've seen with his COVID strategy, it blows back on him very strongly. And so you can't talk about zero COVID without talking about President Xi, because they are inextricably intertwined. I don't think the backlash over zero COVID will be enough to prompt suggestions of real regime change in China. I've heard some speculation about a palace coup, about others in the Communist Party or the Politburo who might backstab Xi because they've seen him weakened over this debacle. I don't think that's particularly likely, partially indeed because he has removed his opposition
quite effectively,
and centralized around himself very effectively. So I don't think any of these really structural changes will happen right away, but it has shown both internally and externally that President Xi is weaker than he would like us to believe.
Very interesting. Do you agree with that, Ben?
Yes, I think it's highly unlikely it will lead to regime change. I think you might see it get pinned on some junior members of the Chinese Communist Party. I think Xi Jinping, I think to link to what Luke was saying, is a really interesting character in himself. I think similar to Vladimir Putin, he's not your regular dictator. He has a real ideological drive behind him. Like his backstory is really interesting. He was born into sort of Chinese Communist Party royalty, sent down to some family was devastated during the Great Purge under Mao, worked his way back up. He is a true believer in China and the future of China. And I think, like Putin, that makes him all the more dangerous in when his country faces difficult circumstances. So yes, I'd agree. So it's a bit of a tangent there, but
it's interesting that if ideology is the driving force rather than, I suppose, personal power, then they could do things that might actually hinder them. So, for example, starting a world war won't look great for Xi Jinping's power because he will be presumably, there wouldn't really be a country to rule over if there's a nuclear war. So Luke, do you agree with that assessment that Xi Jinping is like Putin? Because I've heard and read commentators that, of course, there are similarities. They're both dictators. They've both consolidated their power in recent years. That Putin is perhaps a little bit more unhinged. I don't know what the right word would be. Less, his calculations are not as effective. But then there's also the fact that Xi Jinping, the Communist Party matters in China, whilst in Russia, Putin does not really even have to even use a party. In fact, he wasn't elected in one at all. So it's much more personalised than it is in China. So in that way, I suppose there's more of a way for them to remove Xi Jinping, even though as you were saying, it's very hard to do that. It's perhaps easier in China than it is in Russia. What similarities or differences do you think, Luke?
I think it's remarkable, actually, how both Putin and Xi are kind of haunted by the ghosts of the recent past. They both look to the experience of their country towards the end of the Cold War and during the 1990s, and they reject the progression that their countries underwent in that period. I mean, we saw relatively recently on the news that the former Chinese Premier Jiang Zemin died, and he was the one who was in charge during and shortly after the Tiananmen protests. And it's under Premier Jiang that China moved towards a kind of political pluralism within the Communist Party. We saw more kind of collegial rule, which was best exemplified by Hu Jintao, who of course was recently escorted out of the proceedings and rather publicly humiliated by Xi. Xi rejects the Jiang and the Hu period of Chinese history. He finds that kind of inter-party collegialism to be completely at odds with his view of Chinese government. He wants Mao-style centralized, it's been called imperial rule, and that's it's a rejection of the last 20 years. And in Putin, you see an almost a horrified revulsion at the Boris Yeltsin years, a revulsion at the idea of allowing Belarus and Ukraine and Kazakhstan to be independent nations, a revulsion at crash capitalism and this integration with the West on intergovernmental and financial institutions. There's this idea in both Putin and in Xi that their countries made terrible mistakes in the aftermath of the Cold War, and that it's their job and theirs alone as individual men to kind of retract and rectify those changes and put in place a new model. They both believe that they are the origins of a kind of new consensus and a form of thought. It's more formalized in China under the principle of Mao Zedong thought and Deng Xiaoping thought, and now Xi Jinping thought has been integrated into the constitution in a written fashion. But it's the same in Russia as well with Putin. Putin believes he's putting forward a new model for Russian government for the next half a century or more, and Xi Jinping thinks he's doing the same thing for China. And whether that will pan out remains to be seen. It doesn't look too likely for Putin, I have to admit. Whereas Xi's regime may be a bit more durable. But that's the main commonality between them, I would say.
Very interesting, thank you for that. So lastly on China, under the David Cameron administration, we tried to woo China, and Rishi Sunak claimed in the leadership election, the first leadership election of this year that he was involved in, that the golden era of China relations are over. Do you agree with that statement, or should we be a little bit more optimistic and not rule out collaborating with a country which is a significant trading partner and an economic powerhouse? Or should we say, no, it is over, this is a country that is a dictatorship and is committing genocide? At least that's being heavily reported that it is. What do you think on that, Luke?
I think this is probably the thorniest political question of our times, and one which we won't see a clear answer to until the end of this decade, because the unavoidable fact is that we are extremely economically dependent on China, and they are extremely economically dependent on the West. And those linkages which we've built up in the period since the 1990s are not easily severed. And there's not necessarily a great deal of impetus to sever them at the moment. We are neither enemies nor friends of China at the moment, and they think of us the same way. We're in a weird limbo state where it's possible for relations to either improve or decline very significantly over the next 5 to 10 years. And either way, that will come with very significant economic and political consequences for both the West and for China. It's very clear, I think, that we have issues with Chinese domestic and foreign policy that are not going to be resolved. They won't stop what they're doing in Xinjiang with the Uyghur population. They won't stop agitating about Taiwan. They won't stop integrating Hong Kong into the broader Chinese economic model and Chinese political model, which we, particularly in Britain, are aggrieved by. But at the same time, making enemies of them is going to be extremely damaging to us economically. And although it's there is a temptation to make a grand political stand about this, and I feel the same temptation when that impacts, for example, the cost of living in Britain as significantly as it likely would. That's a very difficult choice for politicians in power. And we will have to negotiate this challenge over the next 10 years. We will perhaps, hopefully, the optimistic outcome is we might see China backing away from the precipice that it's currently on. We might see a reduction in tensions around Taiwan. We might see liberalization of their COVID policy because they can't do anything else for fear of rebellion. Those would feed into the idea of more positive relations between the West and China in the next 10 years. But they could just as easily go the other way. They could just as easily crack down on the protests, agitate about Taiwan, and continue what's going on in Xinjiang. And then we would be put in a very tight bind with regards to our future relations with China.
Thank you, Luke. Ben, what's your assessment? Same question.
I think the only reason Rishi Sunak is saying this is because the same backbenchers who have spent 30 years being sort of mad with rage over Europe, now having got their way on Europe, are now realising there are other things happening in the world. And they have turned their ire on China. Not undeservingly, in my view. But the UK rolling over for brutal dictatorships is nothing new. We are still refuse to say a bad word about the Saudis. Indeed, the West was very happy to fund Saddam Hussein until it wasn't. There is nothing new about the West rolling over for any dictator who gives them beneficial trade terms or any geopolitical clout. And I think this whole business over taking a tougher line on China is solely a result of backbench ire, because he's facing backbench rebellions on most major issues now. And China is one area where he can say fluff. I mean, he said something during the Tory leadership campaign about how as Prime Minister, the leadership campaign he lost, about how he would respect the economic links with China whilst condemning their human rights record, which is ludicrous. Ludicrous. It's like, we oppose Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's awful. We're not going to support that. We're going to keep buying their cheap oil. It's ludicrous. But he's saying this because it's red meat to the backbenchers. It's totally meaningless, and Britain has no credibility at all when it claims to have a moral stance on dictatorships. We are still ignoring a brutal war in Yemen.
Which is a good point, and I suppose that could be a different topic in itself on the big picture about Britain's foreign policy and who are our friends and who are our enemies. Thank you both for your answers on China and the recent protests. We're going to take a break, and hopefully we'll be back afterwards, but I'll need to check to make sure no one wants to come in and do their slot. Apologies again for the later time slot today. Just before I take the break, Lucy from Beeson is glad that we're in the studio and is enjoying the show as always. So thank you, Lucy, very much for listening. Always appreciated your listenership, and I hope that you do find the show as interesting as you do find it enjoyable. So thank you very much. Not linked to China. I'm not going to try and make any tenuous link to this, but it is now December, so here's a Christmas song.
This is University Radio Nottingham.
Hello and welcome back to The Big Picture. We're live on University Radio Nottingham and in a slightly later than billed time due to earlier issues. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Felix Hawes. Our second topic is one of Labour's policies. Another one has come out of the woodwork, although they have announced this earlier on, but it's gained a lot of traction more recently, is Labour's policy of abolishing the charity status of independent schools, or fee-paying schools in other words, and that's been on the tackline of Keir Starmer quite a lot this week. Rishi Sunak, of course, attended a fee-paying school, as of course did Keir Starmer. But the policy is that they want to abolish the charity status, which gives independent schools a VAT exception. There are arguments against this as well as for this, but we'll hear what the panel has to say first, and if one of the positions are not taken by the panel, then as an impartial host I may have to suggest the alternative arguments to see what our panellists say on that. Now, I know that Ben is a big, passionate supporter of Keir Starmer's suggestions, so let's go to him first. Ben.
Yes, I think it's a splendid idea. I mean, it's interesting, because I thought the Tories opposed people scrounging off the state. I think what is it, 1.1 billion or something? I mean, I agree with everything Keir Starmer said, really, at a time when 40% of children in Southampton do not pass GCSE English and maths, at a time when that there were 40 new physics teachers last year, 40 for the whole country, because the teaching career is so underfunded and so devalued in comprehensives. I think that it's ridiculous that we give this money to private schools who don't need it and who perform very little charitable function in real life. I went to a comprehensive. There was a private school up the road. In return for their charitable status, they would invite 5 children from the local comp, of which I was one, to go and see a lovely presentation by Russell Group Universities for a morning, and then we would go home and they would go back to their usual business. It's a splendid idea, and we should absolutely do it.
Okay, fair enough. There's lots of positives there, and the majority of the population do agree with you, quite overwhelmingly so. Actually, I think only 18% oppose the policy. But I will come back to some of your points in a minute, Ben. But we'll go to you, Luke. What are your thoughts on this first?
I find myself feeling quite ambivalent about Keir Starmer's proposals, to be honest, in the strange sense that I don't think they're radical enough. I think removing charity status on its own is a good bit of red meat to throw to the base, but it's not enough to affect a broader realignment of our education policy, which is what we really need. And I think a lot of what Ben highlighted more relates to the education sector as a whole. Removing the 1.1 billion paid to private schools is not enough to fix the deficit of science teachers and what have you. I mean, there's an argument to be made, I think, that in a future Britain with a very different education policy, there should be no room for private schools because they wouldn't be needed. We might look at the example of Finland, for example, where private tuition is illegal. And you see a situation where the well-to-do are incredibly invested in education policy and use their considerable political influence to make sure that schools are ran well and funded well, because their children are the ones who are on the line, as well as the children of everybody else. We don't see that in Britain. We see the elite comfortable in the knowledge that their children will be taken care of at their own expense. And so they don't really need to be invested in public education. They don't really need to be invested in education policy at large, because there's no incentive for them to do so. So as much as charitable status or not is an interesting policy as an individual, I want to see something more radical from Keir Starmer on education. And I don't think you could fix private schooling by making them pay taxes. I think that's kind of a red herring, and I think we need to see from a Labour government some concrete proposals to fund the education sector more broadly. Whether or not that's with interaction with private schools or with like a return to grammar schools and merit-based schooling and that kind of thing, there are a lot of options in this area of varying popularity, and we've yet to see Labour take any position really.
This is all very interesting. A lot of stuff to unpack, a lot of points to be made. I mean, one of your points about making it the fact that maybe if state education was more invested in, then it could be the case that independent schools wouldn't be required, because no one would need or feel they need to send their children there instead. I think Anthony Crosland, who is one of the architects of the comprehensive system, argued that they wanted to make private schools redundant by parents not wishing to actually send their children there. This is a battle that the Labour Party have threatened to do before and never have, and this is because you could argue that they have been told when they get into government of the consequences of abolishing the charity status. And now this is what I'm going to put to you both, and you may think that this is unlikely to happen, which is fine, and you can of course advocate that position shortly. But there are of course risks that if you abolish the charity status, that the fees go up. And if the fees go up, then there will be some schools that can no longer function, and those children are then enter the state system. And if the education system but by the way, there'll be more pupils entering the state system than the benefits would be got from the direct taking of the tax, the extra VAT tax from the independent schools, whilst at the moment those children, their parents are paying for their state education that they're not actually having. So there's more money given to other pupils at the moment, because those that are privately educated are not are not receiving the state education that they're paying for via their taxes, that state schools will become overwhelmed. It's estimated perhaps that 200 independent schools of 1,300 would close. There's also the risks of talking about teachers and jobs. There's 300,000 people employed in private education. That doesn't just involve teachers. There are grounds people, matrons. There are secretaries, cleaners, etc. You have to make. There's also the argument if these state schools, private schools rather, close, what happens to their facilities that the private schools operates, cathedral choirs, and things like that. If they become academies, who decides who goes to the schools with better facilities? You may still think whatever system is in place is better than the current system, which is based on wealth. There's also, of course, people that get significant bursaries to go to independent schools that will no longer be able to afford that. There's the argument against... I'm relaying a lot of information. You can choose what you want to battle here and what ones you don't want to in a minute. There are children of those that work in the armed forces that require boarding provision. What if boarding schools shut? Where do those children go? What about children that their parents can no longer afford their education and they're midway through their GCSEs and A-levels? Where do they go? Because the Labour Party, they're not a government yet, I do apologise, although maybe they will be by the time you listen to this broadcast. They've said that this would happen straight away. There wouldn't be a gradual process, so it's not like they would say, okay, to allow families that are currently having children in their public examinations. So what happens there? There are a lot of positions here. So really, if you've got... in fact, it's estimated that it would cost about 3.5 billion, the extra children that would enter the state system, which is about, what would that be, 3 times more than the money raised from the increased VAT because of the amount of extra people in the state education system. It's also important to acknowledge that although, of course, schools getting more money is always beneficial to be able to provide each child with a textbook, etc., etc., but there isn't a correlation of money and results. I take Cambridgeshire, for example, my home county, which is the second least funded county in education, but is not the second worst performing area in academic performance. So it's there's a lot of things that I know I've just said. It's because, of course, no one was advocating the position. So as an impartial host, I'm putting forward the alternative view. I know there's a lot there to respond to, so I don't expect you to answer everything there. You probably don't remember everything I've said. But what do you make of some of the points I've mentioned, Ben?
Well, I'd like to start by something you said in your intro. I believe you said Keir Starmer went to an independent school. I'm not sure that's right. I think he went to a grammar school which was converted into one after he left.
He was still there when he was in the sixth form. It was converted into an independent school.
Fair enough. I'll claim a draw on that one then. But no, no, it's not an issue for me, the issue of kids in private schools having to go to state schools and if there is any extra cost, because that means they're not paying for a better, for an unfairly better shot at life. I mean, to be honest with you, whilst generally I'm amicable on most issues on education, I'm really not a fan of selective education in general at that young an age. And I think the idea that solely because of your parents' bank balance you can have an easier track in life, and then you can find another parent at the school who has a barrister's chamber or something else, and through that you can get a work experience there. The whole idea is asinine. I thought we should have moved on from that in the 1900s. Not that we're still living with it today, with a prime minister who, the former prime minister, press spokesman Allegra Stratton, was married to the editor of The Spectator, who had met Rishi Sunak when they were good friends at Charterhouse. No, not Charterhouse.
Winchester.
Westminster, wasn't it?
So Rishi Sunak was Winchester.
Oh, right.
Yeah, don't worry. Yeah, it's still a top independent school.
It's absurd. Yeah. It's absurd. And so, no, the issue of any extra cost, which I'm not sure there would be, because there are 600,000 children who attend private schools, and I'm sure plenty of them are very wealthy and would be able to afford an increase in fees, wouldn't bother me anyway, because the whole idea you pay for a better life at that young an age, and an easier track in life, I think is just outrageous. So no, it didn't disturb me at all. And the arguments about the loss of jobs, well, money being put in elsewhere would also create jobs. So jobs are stopped elsewhere and created elsewhere and created in other areas. So none of those concerns really bother me. It's just the whole principle that the state is subsidising private education, I just think is outrageous. And surely any free market Tory would embrace the idea that, they should be competitive on their own front, and it's about going out and building for yourself, because the Tories would never fund an area that's not able to stand on its own 2 feet because they vote for them, because that would be far too cold a decision for them to make. So no, none of those concerns bother me.
Okay, that's interesting. Very valid points put forward by you there. Luke, what do you make of what I said, what Ben said? And what about also, again, as I said in my long spiel, about the cultural losses that potentially happen, like cathedral choirs? And what about international students and the global reputation of Britain? That there's a lot of income that comes from international students coming to Britain for independent schools. I'm sorry to add another thing at you. You can choose what you wish to discuss, though. What do you think?
Thank you very much. This is clearly a subject in which our impartial host is both very well informed and very passionate about, but he's keeping it restrained for the purposes of the show. I agree that there would be short-term disruption to independent schools if the charity status was revoked. But I do agree with Ben that the children affected would be from families best able to cope with disruption. Who is hiring private tutors, for example? It is overwhelmingly those kinds of families. But the broader point about what happens to private education in the future, I do think I agree with the Labour politicians in the 1960s and 70s who proposed outcompeting the private sector in this issue. Public education with proper investment could be good enough to eliminate the need for private schools. And at that point, all of these short-term concerns, which are valid, and you're right to highlight them, but they would not be issues in 20 years' time. They'd be issues for the next 5 years or so. And I think the government would be right to support the disrupted pupils, the ones who are doing their GCSEs, for example. It would be right to allow continuity of their education with public money, but I don't think that these short-term issues should distract us from the broader question of what we do with private education in the future. And another point which I think is quite interesting is that there's a regional element to schooling, and there's a regional element to the locations in which well-off families reside and the kinds of schools in those areas. To speak to my personal experience, the high school that I attended for my GCSEs was one of the worst in my region. It was so bad, in fact, that after I was finished there, they closed and demolished it the very next year. It failed all of its Ofsted reports and what have you. It was a disaster. And then I went on to a local sixth form, which used to be a grammar school, and it's the school that former Conservative leader William Hague went to, with a Latin motto and blazers and the whole thing. But that was just another state school. The regional divergence there was overwhelming. I essentially went from one end of the system to the other, and having since spoken to people who went to independent schools, I realized that the education I received at that former grammar school was as good, if not sometimes occasionally better, than what they got and paid out of pocket tremendous sums for. It is possible for the state education sector to be good and to be high quality, but it needs the investment and the long-term strategy to get there. I don't necessarily think that private schools are an obstacle to good public schools, but as I highlighted in my first point, I think if the incentive was there, and the incentive was put quite strongly to the families of the well-to-do that they need to be interested in education policy and they need to agitate for good education policy, we would see a significant improvement in state education, and thus these short-term questions about what happens to private school and their charitable status and what have you would fall into the background somewhat.
Very interesting points. Very interesting points. I think we'll leave it there, but I will say so that neither of you believe this is levelling down, of course. But as an impartial host, I will also add another point in favour of the arguments that more you are saying, Ben, is that about the charity status and what clarifies what do they need to do to qualify as a charity is decided often by the trust of the independent school rather than a governmental body. So as long as the governors or the trust believe that the school is performing a charitable function, then this is not the case for every independent school, but a lot of them, then it qualifies for that. So another alternative perhaps would be to have a governmental body that actually oversees the charitable status, because there does seem to be a range of what independent schools do. Some independent schools do an awful lot with their local comprehensive schools, and others don't do much at all. But that's a discussion for another time. We'll briefly go on to our third topic. In fact, because of the time issues, we're just going to have a ident play, and then we'll go on to our third topic. That's if it works. It's not loading, which is jolly good. All right, we'll just go into our third topic. As long as my panelists don't mind not having a break.
Shoot.
We'll just cover this briefly if you don't mind. So, onshore wind. Here we are. Here's the ident.
This is University
Radio
Nottingham.
Hello, welcome back to The Big Picture. And it's about to play Last Christmas, so we'll stop that now. Okay, so the onshore wind. Onshore wind is currently, there's a lot of restrictions put forward by David Cameron of onshore wind. Rishi Sunak wants to keep these restrictions. But there is a movement put forward by the former Levelling Up Secretary, Simon Clarke, to allow more onshore wind. This is backed by former Prime Ministers Liz Truss and Boris Johnson and the Labour Party. Briefly to you both, do you think that more onshore wind is a good idea? And do you think this amendment to an existing bill is going to pass? Let's start with you, Ben.
Well, this is the first time that I can remember there's been a backbench Tory rebellion to make the government more reasonable. Yes, I think it's absurd that there are such restrictions on building wind farms. I like the triple locks. It's another thing Rishi Sunak has worked out is going to kill him at the next election if he does it, even though it's obviously the right thing to do. The UK is not in a position right now to be questioning where it gets its energy from, and any form of energy generation, especially green energy generation, should be looked at very positively. And the fact that he is not doing it because he's worried about countryside Tory NIMBYs, NIMBY of course meaning not in my backyard person, is emblematic of the traditional Tory instinct to be elected and stay in power above all else, very much including the public good. So yes, he should absolutely, that I wish Godspeed to the rebels that they make the government change their mind.
You're backing Liz Truss and Boris Johnson,
yes.
Ben. We're hearing it in the
Pro-growth.
radio. Pro-growth.
Of wind
You're
farms.
not part of the anti-growth coalition that we
no.
keep hearing about. What do you reckon to this, Luke?
No, I completely agree. I think it's baffling that the government is not on board with this. And I think it also shows it highlights a broader problem with Conservative Party support at the moment, where a lot of the traditional countryside Tories have interests which are greatly at odds with the kind of people who voted Conservative in 2019. The kind of person who voted for Boris Johnson and didn't vote for other Conservatives is exactly the kind of person who would like to see cheaper energy bills by any means necessary. And I think particularly with what's going on in the world right now, as Ben said, we can't be picky about our energy sources, particularly our renewable energy sources. And doing anything that serves only one portion of a very broad Tory voter coalition just seems not only to be a bad idea from a public good point of view, but it seems to be bad political strategy as well. It seems like serving a particular voter demographic which is always going to vote Conservative over other demographics who are much more likely to flex towards Labour in the next election.
Very interesting, and you touched there on, Luke, on the coalition of Conservative voters. Of course, every party in a first-past-the-post system does have a different variety of people that vote for them, and this is a problem that is the government's having on lots of issues, such as housing as well, with the NIMBYs that Ben mentioned. There's the government's housing policies of wanting to build more homes has got a lot of opposition from those Conservatives in countryside seats. There's also the trade deals with Australia and New Zealand undercutting British farming, and the agricultural subsidies as well, which are causing problems. And the Liberal Democrats have spotted this. So a lot of those policies the Liberal Democrats are acting upon. That is very interesting with onshore wind. I wonder whether or not this amendment will work. Do you think it will? Just briefly, do you think the amendment will pass with the backing of Labour?
My guess would be no, because I think Rishi Sunak does not want to be seen as being crippled by his backbenchers, as his previous two prime ministers, well, certainly his previous prime minister was.
Luke, what do you think?
It's an interesting test of authority. It depends on how much the government attaches itself to that flagpole. I think it's possible that the government will reach an agreement with the backbenchers and some form of the amendment will be passed.
Yeah.
I think we're more likely to see that than a dramatic rebellion, particularly given how early we are into Sunak's term.
Yes, of course. Early, has he quite managed the 50 days of Liz Truss yet? I don't know.
No, I don't think so.
So, thank you very much, everybody, for listening to The Big Picture on University Radio Nottingham. Apologies again for the delay, and thank you for listening. I know it's now 6:30, but thank you for listening, and thank you very much to Ben and Luke for coming on and for accommodating the time issues and getting into the studio.
Always a pleasure, Felix.
So thank you both for coming on. You're both great guests as always. And thank you very much to our regular listeners, Lucy, who's messaged in from Beeston, and her housemates, Ella and Sarah and Daniel and Isabel and George Scotland's aunt and my parents and anyone that's listened that knows Ben and Luke. Thank you very much for listening. We should be back hopefully at the regular time of 5 o'clock next week. It is, as I mentioned earlier, December, so enjoy another Christmas classic. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.